On March 23, 2009, FedEx Express Flight 80, registered November 526 Foxtrot Echo, was approaching Narita International Airport in Japan. It had departed from Guangzhou, China, carrying cargo. The crew was experienced. Captain Kevin Kyle Mosley, 54, with 12,800 flight hours and more than 950 on the MD-11, and First Officer Anthony Stephen Pino, 49, with 6,300 total hours and 700 on type. It was just another route, until it wasn't. Seconds before touchdown, something went out of control. What followed was captured on cameras, in reports, and in the memory of everyone who was at the airport that day. But the Narita episode would not be isolated, and, as would be discovered decades later, it would not be the last. On November 4, 2025, UPS Airlines Flight 2976, an MD-11 freighter, took off from Muhammad Ali International Airport in Louisville, Kentucky, bound for Honolulu, Hawaii. Moments after beginning its takeoff roll, what had started as an ordinary night of operations ended, once again, in tragedy. The NTSB investigation began immediately, and what investigators are uncovering is alarming, to the point of raising, with an urgency that can no longer be ignored, the question of permanently retiring every MD-11 still in operation in the world. The MD-11 was born out of necessity and pressure. McDonnell Douglas had built its reputation on the DC-10, an aircraft that dominated international routes through the 70s and 80s, and placed the company on equal footing with Boeing and Airbus. But the market was moving forward, and the DC-10 was aging. The obvious alternative would have been to develop an entirely new aircraft. The problem, McDonnell Douglas had neither the money nor the time. The solution was to improve what already existed, take the DC-10, tested, familiar, respected, and inject it with the technologies available at the time. The result was called the MD-11. In theory, it would be the best of both worlds, the reliability of a legacy and the modernity of a new era. In practice, it would be something more complicated. The company was struggling with growing competition. Boeing was launching the 767, Airbus the A340. The MD-11 could not merely be good, it needed to be convincing. And so, with ambitions larger than its resources, McDonnell Douglas went to market with an aircraft that promised far more than it could deliver. The official announcement came on December 30, 1986. Its first test flight occurred in January 1990. Between the announcement and that flight, McDonnell Douglas constructed a compelling narrative, and each element of that narrative carried embedded within it a decision that reduced margins. The promised range exceeded 13,000 kilometers. Fuel efficiency compared to the DC-10 would reach 15%, passenger capacity between 298 and 410 depending on configuration, numbers that on paper place the MD-11 ahead of any direct competitor. The cockpit was among the first to implement advanced automation, and that eliminated the need for a flight engineer. The minimum crew dropped from 3 to 2. For airlines, it was an irresistible economic argument. For the aircraft, it was an equation of precision. Every decision that had previously been distributed across 3 pairs of eyes now fell on 2. The winglets were a surprising innovation for widebodies. The plane was one of the first major commercial aircraft to adopt them prominently, projecting a reduction of up to 3% in fuel consumption. For transcontinental flights, that translated into concrete savings over years of operation. Another innovation was the fuel management system with rear wing storage, designed to optimize the center of gravity during flight. As fuel was consumed, the system redistributed weight to maintain balance, an elegant solution to a real problem on long-range aircraft. There was also an automated engine thrust reduction system during cruise, continuously adjusting performance to minimize consumption. It was an airline's dream. What was not written in the promotional brochures was the cost of these choices, an aircraft that depended on precise systems functioning perfectly, with a reduced crew and aerodynamic characteristics that left little margin for the unexpected. None of this was apparent in 1986, but it was there, waiting. Before the first test flight, McDonnell Douglas had already accumulated more than 50 firm orders. With additional commitments, that number would surpass 100 units. The enthusiasm was not naive. It was grounded in the DC-10's reputation and the concrete promises that accompanied the program. American Airlines ordered 19 units, seeing the plane as a natural replacement for part of its DC-10 fleet. Delta reserved 20. Finnair was the first European carrier to commit, with plans for routes to Asia and North America. Swissair placed the biggest bet, 16 units to replace its DC-10s. Japan Airlines ordered 10, targeting its trans-Pacific routes. Alitalia, Thai Airways, Varig, and KLM also placed initial orders. The list price ranged between $120 and $150 million per unit. McDonnell Douglas projected reaching up to 300 orders over the production run. What that enthusiasm proves, looking back, is that the MD-11 was not a bad aircraft. It was an aircraft that convinced, that had real arguments, that carried the weight of a solid legacy. Nobody expected what would come next, and that fact is essential to understanding the trajectory that followed. Problems came quickly. Even during the first delivery flights, the specifications began to be revised downward. The promised maximum range of 13,000 kilometers was rarely achieved under normal flight conditions. Aircraft delivered in the early 90s barely reached 12,000 kilometers. For some intercontinental routes, that meant unplanned stopovers, extra costs, and contract renegotiations. The promised 15% fuel savings came in at 10 to 12% in practice, enough to be better than the DC-10, not enough to compete with what was arriving. These limitations had invisible practical consequences. An aircraft operating near the edge of its range carries less margin for the unexpected. A heavier takeoff, an unfavorable headwind, a rerouting, each variable reduced the buffer further. And then the cancellations came. Singapore Airlines, which had placed orders, withdrew. JAL and KLM reduced theirs. The market was beginning to point in a different direction. The Boeing 777 and the Airbus A330 arrived on the market in the early 90s with a proposition that went beyond economic efficiency. They were simpler aircraft, 2 engines instead of 3, fewer interdependent systems, fewer points of failure. Advances in jet engine reliability allowed twin jets to perform transatlantic and trans-Pacific flights, a capability that had previously required trijet or quad-engine aircraft. The MD-11, by contrast, had been designed on the opposite premise: add systems to gain efficiency. Each system added was a bet on perfection. The 777, in particular, quickly became the preferred choice for airlines requiring longer range, with greater efficiency and lower maintenance costs. The result was inevitable. MD-11 sales collapsed. The type could no longer compete with newer aircraft. And there was more. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, problems began to emerge that were frequently reported by pilots and mechanics. The MD-11 had handling characteristics that made pilots' work more difficult, especially during landing. The horizontal stabilizer design created a tendency toward instability during critical phases of flight. The aircraft was more susceptible to oscillations during final approach and touchdown, demanding from pilots a degree of precision that went beyond the standard expected of other aircraft of comparable size. The control systems were highly sensitive. Minimal inputs produced pronounced responses. Under normal conditions, this was manageable. Under adverse conditions, an instrument approach or a crosswind gusts, the margin shrank rapidly. These characteristics did not cause accidents on their own, but they made any failure, human, structural, or environmental, far more difficult to recover from. A tired pilot, an unexpected crosswind, a momentary distraction. On another aircraft, that might be a scare. On the MD-11, it could be the beginning of a tragedy. It did not take long for the tide to turn against McDonnell Douglas. In 1998, Swissair Flight 111 went down in the Atlantic near Halifax, Canada. There were no survivors. The direct cause was a fire started by a multimedia entertainment system installed in the cabin, not an intrinsic failure of the airframe. But the incident added another layer of distrust toward the type. In 2009, Narita, FedEx Flight 80 rolled over on the runway after a failed landing. NTSB investigators identified multiple factors: an exhausted pilot, adverse weather conditions with winds of 35 kilometers per hour and gusts of 60 kilometers per hour, and what the report described as a design structurally ill-suited to the demands of the operation. None of those factors alone would have been sufficient. Together, there was no margin for recovery. Halifax, Narita, each with its own specific circumstances, each with its declared causes, but all with something in common. UPS Flight 2976 was an MD-11F, a 34-year-old aircraft originally delivered to Thai Airways in 1991 and converted to freighter configuration before joining UPS in 2006. On the night of November 4, 2025, it had accumulated 21,043 flight cycles and approximately 92,992 hours of operation. It departed Louisville at 5:14 p.m. local time, bound for Honolulu. It took just 20 seconds for everything to fall apart. Airport surveillance cameras captured what the flight data later confirmed. Shortly after rotation, the left engine, number 1, and its pylons separated from the wing. A fire broke out immediately at the attachment area. The aircraft never climbed above 30 feet. As it crossed the containment fence at the end of runway 17 right, the left landing gear struck the roof of a UPS warehouse. The rest, we all know. The NTSB arrived in Louisville the following day and began collecting data. What the agency's materials laboratory found in the weeks that followed was precise and disturbing. The spherical bearing of the left pylon rear mount, the component that anchors the engine to the wing, had fractured into two pieces. Analysis of the fracture surface revealed fatigue cracks originating along the entire inner circumference of the bearing, starting from a design groove in the component. This fatigue cracking extended through approximately 75% of the total thickness of the part. The remainder showed characteristics of overload failure, meaning that once fatigue had compromised most of the structure, what remained simply gave way under the weight of the engine during rotation. Up to that point, a tragic but isolated accident. What would make the finding truly alarming came next. When investigating the component's history, the NTSB issued on February 7, 2011, Service Letter MD-11 SL54104A. In that document, the manufacturer had warned operators about 4 previous failures of the same spherical bearing, part number S003991, across 3 different aircraft. In every case, the cracking had initiated at the exact same location, the design groove on the inner surface of the race. Boeing knew, and in its 2011 assessment, it concluded that the failure did not represent a flight safety concern. The service letter recommended periodic visual inspections at 60-month intervals and suggested installing an updated version of the bearing, which eliminated the problematic groove, only in the event of replacement for a defective part. Installation of the original part was never prohibited. The aircraft had undergone a visual inspection of the rear pylon mount in October 2021, more than 4 years before the accident. The more rigorous special detailed inspections were not overdue. The cycle thresholds required for those procedures were 28,000 and 29,200 cycles, and the aircraft had accumulated 21,043. By the logic of the maintenance manual, it was within parameters. Fatigue, however, does not consult manuals. Following the accident, the FAA issued an emergency airworthiness directive, effectively grounding all MD-11s in operation worldwide. The DC-10, the predecessor aircraft with a similar pylon design, was also grounded days later. The action was immediate and global. UPS moved ahead even before the official directive. On November 7, 2025, 3 days after the accident, the company announced the precautionary grounding of its entire MD-11 fleet. On January 27, 2026, during the fourth quarter earnings call, CEO Carol Tomé announced the complete and accelerated retirement of the type. The company recorded $137 million write-down on the retired fleet, part of $238 million in special charges for the quarter. As a replacement, UPS is awaiting delivery of 18 new Boeing 767s, with 15 of them expected in 2026. The maintenance cost of operating a fleet of aircraft over 30 years old, combined with the reputational and financial impact of the accident, made the equation impossible to sustain. FedEx, which had 34 MD-11s in its fleet at the time of the accident,
25 of them in active operation, took a different position. Grounding the fleet cost the company approximately $175 million in losses during the peak season, plus around $25 million in direct alternative freight costs.
Even so, the company announced it was working with Boeing and the FAA to return its MD-11s to service by May 31, 2026.
Through advanced high-frequency eddy current inspections and non-destructive testing, CEO Rajesh Subramaniam described the situation as an unexpected challenge that triggered significant operational changes.
FedEx had, just a few months before the accident, extended its MD-11 fleet retirement deadline from 2028 to 2032.
A decision that, in the wake of the Louisville accident, came to be viewed in a completely different light.